Should the Biden administration raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question.
Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case on libertarianism, economics, the burning issues of the day. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and to have our viewers and listeners join us very kindly once again.
Yeah, welcome to another week of Libertarian Angle. And if you're new to the show, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Come to fff.org, subscribe to FFF Daily, which is free, and our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which is not, but well worth the $25 or the $15 email version. And so, Richard, another bout of classes for you. How are things going there at the Citadel?
Things are going very well. The semester has started a couple of weeks ago. I'm doing my classes live on Zoom from my home, and the students over there, little pictures on the screen almost look lifelike. So things are going well.
And so what are you teaching this semester?
This semester I'm teaching principles of macroeconomics. So I have my opportunities after explaining Keynesian economics to the students to point out maybe a few minor lapses of logic and validity. I wouldn't want to go too far, of course. And the other course I'm teaching is market ethics in modern society, which basically ends up being a detailed analysis and discussion of the philosophic, political, and economic foundations of a free market economy, and a critical look at the critics of capitalism.
All right. Well, as we discussed in the last segment of Libertarian Angle, you are one of the most knowledgeable people on Austrian economics and the Austrian School of Economic Thought, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Israel Kirzner, and the like. And you, of course, were former president of the Foundation for Economic Education and the former Ludwig von Mises professor of economics at Hillsdale College. So last week we discussed Mises's life, and for those of you that didn't tune in, Ludwig von Mises, I consider, and I think Richard would agree with me, is the greatest economist who's ever lived. And he really revolutionized, along with the other Austrians, economics in such a way that it doesn't consist of a bunch of charts and graphs and supply and demand curves, but instead focuses on real people operating in the marketplace and how the market operates, and how government interventionism or welfare statism or warfare statism interferes with that process, or inflationism through a central bank interferes with that process and really destroys the economic well-being of people, not to mention their liberty. So we talked last week about Mises's life in Europe prior to coming over to the United States. We talked about him escaping the German invasion of France. He had been in Switzerland, and he escaped through Vichy, France, I think you said. And he and his wife came over to the United States. So I thought, well, let's pick up the story at that point and talk about what happened when Mises got here. I mean, setting the stage for that story. He comes in an era where, the United States has just fallen into statism totally. I mean, the transformation had taken place in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal era, but it certainly started before that with the income tax in 1913, the Federal Reserve in that same year, the regulatory commissions that were starting to be proposed and come into existence, Antitrust Act, for example. But the real watershed period was the Roosevelt era. And then going up into World War II, we've got a gigantic warfare state now. So we've got the welfare state, the interventionist state, the regulated economy, and then the warfare state. And Mises comes into this with this principled approach to free markets, limited government. And he didn't quite find a ready, receptive audience. Did he, Richard?
No. In fact, I should, in this context, before Mises left Geneva, he wrote a letter to his longtime friend, once colleague, Friedrich von Hayek, who at that time was teaching at the London School of Economics. So Mises is writing this letter from Geneva. It would be around first half of 1940, and Mises is despondent because he says right now we're in a world in which there are only about 6 true liberals left. So when I read this letter, it was in Hayek's correspondence that is at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I thought to myself, well, I guess Mises considers himself one of those handful of 6 real true liberals. I guess since he's writing this to Hayek, I guess he views Hayek as one of the 6. Who the hell are the other 4? He doesn't tell him. I mean, name them. I mean, out of the whole world population, I want to know all 6. Now, that shows a sort of a degree of, let's put it this way, less than optimism about the intellectual climate. But the fact is that in Europe, which was obviously suffering from the extremes of collectivism, there was Stalin's Soviet Union, there was Mussolini's fascist Italy, there was Hitler's Nazi Germany that was now sort of running wild with war in 1940 throughout Europe. And even in countries such as Great Britain, they had introduced increasingly versions of the welfare state and so on. They had gone off the gold standard. But America, at least in European eyes, often still seemed, either whether they approved of it or were critical of it, viewed America as more of a beacon of liberty. And certainly compared to the totalitarian states, America, even under Roosevelt, would have seemed that way to most. But then he comes to the United States in the summer of 1940. He has escaped. As I explained last time, he journeyed by bus through southern France in what was now becoming Vichy France, unoccupied France, but with German patrols still having free access in the French countryside. Reaches Marseille, then goes across the Pyrenees to Spain, from Madrid to Lisbon, Portugal, and is able to book tickets on a ship for him and his wife, Margaret, to America. And he arrives in early August of 1940 at one of the ports near New York City, but actually in New Jersey. And he settles in. But the fact is he's now no longer being paid a salary. He had been paid by European standards fairly well at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. And he arrives and he's now living off his savings and has to now, and remember, he's in his late 50s. I mean, this is a time when many people are, and remember, lifespans were less back then. Mises ended up living into his 90s, but the average lifespan for most Americans was in their mid and late 60s. So at 58, he's had a life that normally would be sort of thinking about the end of a career, right? The last years of one's professional life. He's in America having to start a new career. And what saved him, and this is saying peculiar to some of us, now that we often think of the Rockefeller Foundation as sort of a left-leaning think tank that supports more interventionist intellectual activities and pursuits. Mises knew several of the prominent representatives of the Rockefeller Foundation in Europe in the interwar period, and through those contacts, he actually had a living in America for the first 5 years here through Rockefeller Foundation grants renewed each year, and while looking for a job. And it wasn't easy. First of all, his age. Second of all, he was totally out of the intellectual milieu in the country. Some knew him, but not a lot of Americans compared to many Europeans knowing his name. And then the ideological climate. Shortly after he arrived, he got in contact with Henry Hazlitt, the already well-known free market-oriented journalist who in 1940 was one of the economic editorial writers for the New York Times. And so he contacts Hayek, and Hayek
Hazlitt.
contacts Hazlitt, and Hazlitt, knowing the intellectual circles in New York, contacted a man named Alvin Johnson, who was one of the directors of the New School for Social Research in New York City, and approached Johnson to see if maybe even a temporary position could be arranged for Mises to bring in some income teaching at the new school. And Alvin Johnson said, well, I'll get back to you. And when he did get back to him, he said, well, I spoke to his colleagues, and Mises would be too out of step with his intransigent, reactionary, laissez-faire ideas. Now, if I can add a thing here, one of the paradoxes in this, Jacob, is that shortly after Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, Hitler's government started expelling Jewish professors and restricting professional opportunities for members of the German Jewish community, as well as expelling those out of step with Nazism, old-fashioned German classical liberals. And in around, I guess it was April or May of 1933, Mises enters a cafe in Vienna. And who does he run into? Two Englishmen, a famous friend of his who was an economist at the London School of Economics, Lionel Robbins, and William Beveridge, who at that time was a director of the London School, but also ended up, his claim to fame, helping to construct later the British national healthcare system. And so he sits down with William Beveridge and Lionel Robbins and opens a paper from that day and says, look, Hitler's regime is starting to expel professors, either for ideology or because they were Jewish. Can't we do something to help these people? And the three of them brainstorm. Lionel Robbins tells this story in his own autobiography, that they brainstormed about what international connection should be set up to help these people get jobs out of Germany. And that became an international network, of which the New School for Social Research ended up being a part later on. And so Mises is here setting up the institutional network to help professors who have to escape from Nazi tyranny to have jobs in other places. Yet when he himself arrives in America as a refugee, he is unable to be assisted. So, I mean, that's sort of an irony, a perversity. But anyway, he has the support of the Rockefeller Foundation. And this enables him to have the opportunity to have an income coming in and to be writing. He starts writing articles, but most importantly, he starts writing books. He writes two books that came out in 1944. His little book, Bureaucracy, it's called Bureaucracy, but it's basically an unbelievably simple but delightful writing style, in my opinion. Straightforward, clear. His critique of capitalism versus socialism, market economy versus the errors of central planning. And then also in 1944, he comes out with his book, Omnipotent Government, which is his analysis of how the tyranny of Nazism rose to power in Germany and now is creating the dangers of the end of liberty all over Europe. And he was also able to be writing essays, giving presentations, all of which was becoming difficult. Now, it's all right to admire someone, but you should also realize that sometimes he can be a difficult person. The story often heard is that nobody would give Mises a job anywhere, and that actually wasn't true. One of Mises's own former students from the University of Vienna, Fritz Machlup, who was then teaching at the University of Buffalo, was trying to help arrange university interviews for Mises, and he arranged quite a few. And virtually Mises, most of them turned him down, but a few sort of tentatively said, we would be interested in negotiating Mises coming to our institution of higher learning. The problem is virtually all of these were outside of New York City. And Mises didn't want to be anyplace other than New York, since he considered that the intellectual capital of America. And so it was during those war years, Fritz Machlup writes to Hayek, who's still in London, that Mises is his problem child, that is trying to help him get a position. The upshot of it is he finally is able to land a position, again through friends, at New York University, but not a full professorship or a permanent professorship. What is arranged for him is a position as a visiting professor in the Graduate School of Business Administration at New York University. And he remains a visiting professor from 1945 until he retires in 1969. Surely, if there was such a category, he would be the Guinness Book of Record longest visiting professor in human history. Now, the other thing was, NYU didn't pay his salary. For him to have a salary and for him to have an office space, because right, you meet with students, etc., this had to be arranged through private funding outside of the university. Some private organizations that were pro-market and appreciated him. And that's how his salary was funded for all the years from 1945 to 1969. He was teaching at New York University, during which he usually taught 2 courses. Now, professionally, he was the other thing that this period enabled him to do was that I had mentioned last week when we were talking about his time in Europe, that just before he left Switzerland in summer of 1940, his magnum opus had been published in German. In German, it's called Nationalökonomie. But now, having established himself in the United States, first with these research grants and then finally a visiting professorship, he devoted himself to writing a revised version of that German language book, which appeared in September of 1949 as what is now considered his greatest classic, Human Action, a Treatise on Economics. So what is this book? Well, once Murray Rothbard told me that he had gotten interested in classical liberalism and other ideas and had gotten in touch with what had recently been opened as the Foundation for Economic Education by Leonard Reed up in the Irvington-on-Hudson, just north of New York City. And that his personal contact there was an economist named Floyd Baldy Harper, who later founded the Institute for Humane Studies. And Harper is telling a very young Murray Rothbard, obviously, you have to get to know this fellow Ludwig von Mises. He's writing an important book. And Murray Rothbard, who had a high squeaky voice, said, "What's the book about, Baldy? What's the book about?" And Baldy Harper says, "It's about everything." "What do you mean everything? It's impossible. I'm putting one book about everything." So the book comes out in autumn of 1949, and Murray Rothbard reads it. And as Murray then was telling people like myself, it was it was about everything. It's about everything. So, and it is. He talks about the nature of man, the origins and basis of society, the methodological questions of how do you study human action. It is different from the natural sciences because man has a will, intentionality, the potential for action, imagination, and that we need to look for sources of knowledge within ourselves into the logic of our own mind, and not like the natural sciences who can only observe what it wants to understand from the outside. But from there, he goes into studying the nature of the market economy, the competitive process, the workings of the price system, the limits of government interventionism and the impossibilities of socialism. It's really a book about everything. And slowly but surely that book, while ignored within the mainstream of the economics profession in certainly the decades after it appeared, began to have a following with a wider segment of what today you would say the conservative, the emerging libertarian group of people in the society. It was virtually not reviewed by any noted economist in the mainstream press, and the few that did poo-pooed the book terribly. But slowly but surely, this got him a following and a notoriety. But another thing, so he's teaching at New York University, and it starts drawing people to his seminars. Murray Rothbard, who though earning his own PhD at Columbia University, for years attended Mises's NYU seminars. A young Israel Kirzner, who had earned a bachelor's degree in South Africa, where he was living, where he came from, and had come to NYU to actually become either a CPA or a PhD accountant. He was going to be an accountant, was trying to fill in courses, to meet his requirements. And he opens the catalog of courses and he sees Ludwig von Mises. And his sister had taken a course in South Africa from another free market economist, W.H. Hutt, and Hutt had mentioned Mises' name, and the sister had mentioned Mises' name to a young Israel Kirzner. So he comes to NYU and he's opening, with class offerings. Ludwig, yeah, maybe I'll take that. And what Kirzner said is that the first class session of that term, Mises comes into the classroom, sits down, and begins by saying, the market is a process. As Kirzner years and years later said, that is what set me up. Isn't that a place where people get together, buyer and a seller, like the stock market, you see the pictures of the people in the stock report. What does it mean by a process? And that hooked him and intrigued him to shift from business to economics and to earn his own PhD under Ludwig von Mises. And that enabled him to himself land a job at New York University, a position that he held until he retired. It also attracted another very prominent free market economist in the later sense of influencing people, a German economist named Hans Sennholz. Now, Hans Sennholz had studied in Germany, but got wrapped up in being drafted into the German army in World War II. He was on the wrong side of history. He was on the Nazi side. But ended up being a prisoner of war in Texas, which would be, I have funny stories about that too. He was shot down over Tunisia and ended up being in a POW camp outside of Austin, Texas. And I asked Hans, well, how was it, a prisoner of war camp? And he said, it was the greatest experience I ever had. And I said, Hans, well, what do you mean, a prisoner of war camp in a strange country? I mean, oh, it was wonderful, he said. It's wonderful. You see, the book for our POW camp had been a leading chef in a Berlin restaurant. I never ate so well in my entire life. And then another thing, he had like a distant relative who had immigrated to America decades earlier, who lived in the Austin, Texas area, and they vouched for him. So he then, with a military MP escorting him each time, would attend classes at the University of Texas in Austin. And he's a prisoner of war during the war. So he gets repatriated back to Germany at the end of the war. And he starts attending the university. And he's through the library one day. And he finds this book by Mises. Obviously, he was reading it in the original German. Mises' book on the theory. And he reads this, he finds it fascinating, money, the business cycle, inflation. And so then he comes to the United States to study at NYU. And he's looking through the catalog, Mises. I thought this guy was dead. He wrote this book almost at the beginning of the 20th century. It's now the 1950s. He's alive. So he takes Mises' and ends up writing his dissertation under Mises. It attracted many other people. William Peterson, who became a leading economist. I can't list the numbers. But anyway, so he started having this growing following through his teaching, through his. But then he was writing other books. He wrote essays that he put together in 1952 called "Planning for Freedom," a brilliant critique of various forms of interventionism and government regulation. Jacob is now trying to get his dog to be a polite, quiet listener of my pontificating about the great Mises.
Sorry about that. It's
okay.
My COVID.
So I guess he succeeded. He said, "This is about Mises." The dog said, "Yes, I want to hear." Anyway, so he published another book, Theory and History, in 1957. A book earlier, a year earlier, called "The Capitalistic Mentality: What Attracts People to Socialism and Anti-Capitalist Ideas." And that got him a huge readership because at that time, U.S. News World Report was published and edited by a journalist named David Lawrence. He had founded at U.S. News and World Report in the 1930s. And he was a diehard free market conservative. So when Mises's anti-capitalistic mentality came out, it's not a very long book. He basically published it in total in one of the weekly issues of U.S. News World Report. That's a huge readership. A huge readership. Yeah. Well, what's the Newsweek week? Wow, 45 pages of this week's issue of this news magazine by this Mises guy. Wow, what's this about? So it's a lot of notoriety. And so by the time that he retired by 1969, he passed away in 1973 at the age of 92. He had helped through fostering and cultivating a new generation of, quote, younger Austrian economists to bring about a rebirth of the Austrian school. The significance of this is that when I say that Mises was ignored, he was poo-pooed, you have to remember the intellectual climate in the United States at that time. There was a lot of sympathy for socialism. Oh, Stalin's Russia had helped to win World War II. They were building socialism. Yeah, there was little things rough around the edges. They seemed to arrest, torture, and kill a few people. But, who's perfect? Everybody has their foibles, right? Some people like to torture. Other people like to collect stamps. Who am I to judge? Anyway, so, and then, of course, in the post-World War II period, the primary public policy perspective was government intervention and Keynesianism. The idea that left alone, the economy was inherently unstable, likely to fall into long bouts of high unemployment, like during the Great Depression of the 30s. So you needed activist government, monetary policy, fiscal policy with deficit spending. So Mises's views of limited constitutional government, rule of law, private property, laissez-faire, free market, a wide latitude of individual liberty in both economic and social and personal affairs. All of this was out of step and out of favor. You had to be a brave person and established already in the economics profession to challenge this. For example, one of the University of Chicago famous economists of that era was a man named Frank Knight, who had made his reputation in the 1920s and 30s. So when he gave the presidential address of the American Economic Association in 1950, and was then published a few months later in early 1951, he says in passing near the beginning of his presidential address that John Maynard Keynes has taken back the economics profession to a dark ages. Any economist who didn't have like an independent reputation, that would have been the kiss of death to say Keynesian economics is the dark ages of economics. Never expect to get tenure. Don't even expect to be hired. So this was the intellectual environment of this. So there was no Austrian school. There was no free market movement. Now, of course, there were advocates of the free market. And in fairness, there were members of the Chicago school. There was a young Milton Friedman. There was a young George Stigler. There was Frank Knight himself. He was not a proponent of laissez-faire, but compared to the commies, he was like a free market voice of fresh air. So this was the intellectual environment. So what Mises helped to do was to revive the classical liberal and free market tradition in general, and the particular variation of free market thinking of the Austrian School of Economics. In fact, there would be no Austrian school today if there hadn't been the tragic fortuitous circumstances that Mises felt compelled to leave the Europe of the wartime, come to the United States, and act as a catalyst for its revival in America, from which it then has returned to some extent to economic circles in Europe. He lived until, as I said, 1972. Most of the time he was ridiculed. His critique of socialism was rejected. Oh, look, there's the Soviet Union. And they seem to kill people, but the system works. And if it wasn't for American embargoes on Cuba, why, Castro would have created a paradise already with central planning as evil imperialist embargoes. No. So they have some famine in Mao's China. It must be bad weather. Damn bad weather. It's a communist plot. They must be seeding the clouds or something to make too much rain at harvest time. I mean, this is a nonsense. And of course, they would believe Soviet statistics. We here in Russia have biggest economy, outstripping America. Socialism, good, comrade, very good. They believe all this ridiculous statistics. So to hold views like Mises, I mean, you're Looney Tunes. But the fact is that within a handful of years after his passing in 1973, the Soviet Union begins to and finally implodes. Even mainstream economists who had poo-pooed Mises during his lifetime said, such as a well-known economist named Robert Heilbroner, wrote a widely read book called The Worldly Philosophers. It's basically a history of economic thought book. He writes around the time of the end of the Soviet Union, Mises was right. Oh, I don't mean to say it. Mises was right. I mean, he says this. Yeah, we're critical, but at the end of the day, yeah, you need competition and prices and freedom, damn it, if you want to have a bit of prosperity. And so this was the life. Now, let me say something. You know, you leave America, you leave Europe to come to America. Your English is terrible. Okay, your English is terrible. When Mises was a student, the second language he learned was French. And many people say that he spoke French as well as a Frenchman. But he only learned English from reading on his own. And in fact, as an American economist named Benjamin Anderson said in a letter to Henry Hazlitt, shortly after Mises came to the United States, and Anderson had invited him out to Los Angeles, where Anderson was teaching, to give some guest lectures. Mises's presentations were good, but the problem, when it comes to the English language, he imports better than he exports. Okay, he can understand you, but it's kind of hard to understand this guy. And as Margaret Mises, his widow, once told me, he tried to get Mises to speak English at home, right? Practice. And she tried to penalize him that for every German word he spoke at home, he'd have to pay her a dime. And that's when a dime was big money. He'd rather pay the money than speak English at home. I will not speak English. I'm an Austrian. We speak German. And but his English did improve. There's a handful of audios, some of them available for downloading on the Mises, Ludwig von Mises Institute site. He had a deep baritone voice with a admittedly strong German accent. But he endured, and not only endured, but all the people who knew him during that American period. He's ignored, he's criticized, he's lambasted, he's viewed as a cranky, reactionary, Neanderthal nut. Everybody who knew him says it was like water off a duck's back. He could be bitter, and other friends of his who knew him from the Vienna days said that he could be bitter and despondent, but it never affected him intellectually. He believed in the truth of the ideas that he was attempting to present. The ideas of freedom, free markets, limited government, the power of a free society, the importance of the liberty and the dignity of the individual human being. And so in spite of the intellectual slings and arrows of misfortune, he always saw his task to share the ideas, write about the ideas, and to never compromise, Some people called him intransigent, and that has a negative connotation. He doesn't move, he doesn't compromise. In his mind, he was being true to what he knew to be true, an example of integrity, not intransigence. And in my view, that show what can be seen as the essence of his ideas and his life.
Yeah, that's a really nice summary of Mises's life here. It raises so many questions. We're so short on time, but it really goes to show you what one person can do, the power of just one person. He comes over here, he's alone, he gets assistance from others, but he wasn't entirely alone. He encounters Hazlitt, which is another kind of funny story when Hazlitt picks up the phone and Mises says, "This is Mises," and Hazlitt thought he was like hearing from God or something. And I mean, here's Henry Hazlitt, a libertarian economist, free market economist, writing for the New York Times and for Newsweek too. Didn't Hayek write for Newsweek, or am I thinking Friedman?
Honestly. What happened was that in 1946, around the time that his book Economics in One Lesson appeared, he left the New York Times and began writing a weekly column for Newsweek, which he did for 20 years until 1966.
Yeah, that's incredible. And then you've got Leonard Read, who leaves the Chamber of Commerce to start the Foundation for Economic Education in 46, who has the same vision as Mises in a libertarian sense of no compromise, rely purely on principles. And these three men come together along with other people that Read brought into the Foundation for Economic Education. And this was the dawn of the modern day libertarian movement. Just the small handful of people that adhered to principle. I mean, they were my inspiration. When I discovered libertarianism, it was through Mises and Read and Hazlitt and other people that they were attracting to them. And so you have this huge environment of socialism and statism and interventionism, but you have this relatively small group of people that are like lighting the candle that's shining through the darkness. And look what it's grown into. I mean, look how big the movement now is. So it's really an inspiration for those of us that are continuing this tradition.
You're barking, mine is responding. On that note, we should bring the episode to a close.
Yeah, so we got to wrap things up. My dog, my COVID puppy, my golden retriever needs to go to the restroom, and so I need to be excused at this point. So, Richard, that was a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And again, come to fff.org and visit us, and we'll see you all next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.